That dog's wearing my father's old military tag, I blurted out, nearly tripping over the curb as the shaggy German shepherd trotted toward me. I wasn't even supposed to be walking this road. My truck had overheated again, a recurring problem I'd been ignoring. I'd pulled over and started walking the last mile home in the chilly Indiana dusk, annoyed and muttering under my breath. I had just passed the abandoned Miller barn on Pine Ridge Road when the dog appeared. At first, I thought she was a coyote. Her coat was wild and dust-colored, and she moved low and silent like something used to avoiding people. But then she stopped, just stood there in the middle of the road and looked at me like she'd been waiting for me. That's when I saw the collar, a faded strip of green canvas with a dull metal tag swinging from it. And when the wind turned just right, I caught sight of the lettering. The name on that tag? Henry Boone. That's my father's name. He passed away 10 years ago. "Easy there, girl," I said, raising both hands like I was defusing a bomb. My voice came out shaky. "Where'd you get that?" The dog tilted her head, then did the unthinkable. She trotted up to me like she'd known me forever and nudged my hand with her nose. Her eyes, deep brown and strangely calm, met mine, and she sat. Just like that, right at my feet, like she belonged there. I reached out slowly, fingers trembling, and lifted the tag. It was scratched and worn, but the name was still legible. And the number on the back? I knew it by heart. It was my dad's old service number. I don't remember much of the walk home after that. I just remember her padding beside me, quiet as a whisper. She didn't pull at the leash because I didn't use one. She stayed right by my side, like she knew the route. When we got to the house, my wife Laura met us at the door with a look that said I'd better have a good explanation for why I was bringing a stray dog inside. "She's got my dad's tag," I said, still out of breath. "Henry Boone. It's his tag. Look." Laura blinked. Then she leaned in and took the tag from my hand. Her eyes widened. How is this possible?" I shrugged. "I don't know." Our boys, Sam and Trevor, came running out from the living room, their game controllers still in hand. "Dad, you brought a dog?" Trevor shouted, already down on his knees trying to pet her. "She followed me," I said. "She's awesome," Sam added. "Can we keep her?" That wasn't something I could answer right then. I was still trying to wrap my head around what just happened. The tag was old, the kind issued decades ago. My father had worn it every day of his service, right up until he passed in his sleep at 63. "She must have found it somewhere," Laura said finally, leading the dog to the kitchen for some water. "Maybe someone had it and lost it, and she picked it up." "Maybe," I said, but it didn't sit right. That tag didn't look like it had been buried in the dirt or tossed aside. It looked like it had been worn for a long time. The dog drank gratefully, her tail wagging in slow, steady sweeps. She was thin, but not starving. Her ribs showed, but her eyes were bright. She didn't act like she was afraid of people. She was cautious, yes, but calm. Like she'd been through worse and come out the other side wiser. "Let's take her to the vet tomorrow," Laura said, wiping her hands. "Make sure she's healthy. Maybe she's chipped. Maybe someone's looking for her." I nodded. That seemed like the next logical step. But deep down, I already knew. This dog wasn't just passing through. That night, after the boys were asleep and Laura was reading in bed, I sat in the living room with the dog. I'd given her a blanket near the couch and a bowl of water. She lay there watching me with those deep eyes. "What's your story?" I asked quietly. "Where'd you come from?" She didn't make a sound, but she held my gaze like she understood. The next morning, we loaded her into the back seat of the SUV. She didn't resist. In fact, when I opened the door, she hopped in like she'd done it 100 times. The vet clinic was a small one just outside of town. Dr. Gene Powell had known our family for years. He was already in the exam room when we arrived. "Well, aren't you a pretty girl?" he said, kneeling beside her. "Let's see what you've got there." He scanned her neck for a chip. Nothing. "No ID chip," he said. "But she's healthy. Maybe 6 or 7 years old. She's been on her own for a while, but not too long. Someone fed her at some point." I handed him the tag. Dr. Powell turned it over and froze. This is military issue." "It's my dad's," I said. "Henry Boone." He looked up at me, then at the dog. "Where did you find her?" "She found me." He sat back on his heels and whistled. "That's something." After a long silence, he handed the tag back. "If no one claims her in a week, she's yours legally. Not that she's going anywhere." We drove home quietly, the dog curled up in the back seat. The boys named her Lucky before dinner. "She's lucky she found us," Sam said. "Or maybe we're the lucky ones," Laura replied, smiling. I wasn't sure what to make of it all. I kept staring at that tag, holding it like a relic. It felt like Dad was near, like he'd sent this dog somehow. I didn't say it out loud. Not yet. But that feeling grew stronger every time I looked into her eyes. The next few days were peaceful. Lucky made herself at home quickly. She followed me everywhere, from the garage to the backyard, even when I went to get the mail. She was quiet, obedient, and alert. And then the first strange thing happened. It was Tuesday night. I was outside stacking firewood when she suddenly froze, ears pointed toward the woods behind our house. Then she bolted. "Lucky!" I yelled, dropping the axe. I sprinted after her. She ran straight into the trees, not hesitating. I followed, stumbling over roots and branches, my heart pounding. I found her a minute later, sniffing around a pile of leaves near the old deer stand. "What is it, girl?" she barked once, sharp and loud. I moved closer and saw something glinting beneath the leaves. A compass. Old, scratched, but familiar. I picked it up slowly. On the back, there was a faint engraving. "To Dad, keep your way. Love, Ben." That was the last thing I ever gave my father. He'd lost it years ago during a camping trip. We thought it was gone forever. I stared at Lucky, stunned. She wagged her tail once and sat beside me. I didn't know what was going on, but one thing was certain. This dog was more than she seemed, and whatever journey she'd been on, it had led her straight to us. Not by accident. Not even close. The next morning, I found Lucky waiting by the front door, tail tapping gently on the hardwood floor. She stared at me like she had something to say, like she was ready to lead me somewhere again. The compass sat on the mantel now, cleaned and placed in the center where the sun could hit it. Laura had picked it up that morning and just stared at it for a long time before setting it down without a word. She didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer answers I didn't have. I grabbed my jacket and motioned to Lucky. "Come on, girl. Let's go see what else you've got hidden in those woods." She sprang to her feet like she'd been waiting for the invitation. We walked the same trail as the night before, cutting behind the shed and through the tree line where the land dipped down toward the creek bed. Lucky moved ahead of me, not running but trotting steadily, pausing every now and then to sniff the air or glance back to make sure I was still with her. After about 20 minutes, she stopped beside a fallen oak tree. I thought maybe she'd picked up the scent of a raccoon or some other critter, But then she dug, fast and focused, throwing dirt behind her like she was on a mission. I crouched beside her and helped clear the rest of the earth. We hit something hard. Metal. It was a box. A small, rusted metal tin, the kind people used to keep old photographs in. I brushed off the dirt and flipped it open. Inside were 2 photographs. One of them was of my dad in uniform, smiling and standing in front of his barracks, arms slung around 2 buddies I'd never met. The second photo took my breath away. It was one of me and Dad, taken during my high school graduation. I didn't even remember anyone snapping it. "How on earth did this end up here?" I muttered. Lucky sat beside me, her ears perked forward. I turned both photos over. There was something scribbled on the back of the second one. "For when you need to remember who you are." My breath caught. I'd never seen this before. Dad must have written it, but how it got buried in the woods behind our house, I had no idea. Lucky stood and nudged the box with her nose. Then she turned and started walking back the way we came, like she was saying, "That's enough for now." The rest of the day passed slowly. I kept those photos on the table near my recliner, glancing at them every so often as if they might change. Sam and Trevor came home from school and ran straight to Lucky, who greeted them with gentle tail wags and let them tug on her ears without complaint. She'd become part of the family overnight, like she'd always been there. That evening, Laura joined me on the porch swing. Lucky lay at our feet, head resting on her paws. "You think she's leading you somewhere?" Laura asked. I nodded. "I don't know where or why, but yeah, it's like she's showing me pieces of Dad, like memories he hid for me to find." She rested her head against my shoulder. "Maybe it's more than that. Maybe she's helping you remember yourself." I didn't say anything, but the thought stayed with me. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Lucky would guide me to places on our property, old corners I hadn't visited in years, areas deep in the woods, long forgotten trails. And each time, she found something. A matchbook with the name of a diner my dad used to take me to when Mom was still around. A baseball glove I hadn't seen since middle school, stuffed into a hollow log. An old pocket knife with initials carved into the wooden handle. HB. Everything she found was tied to Dad. It didn't make sense. Not logically, but I stopped questioning it. I just followed her lead. On Saturday, I decided to take her into town. She hadn't been around crowds yet, and I figured a walk through the park would do her good. Sam and Trevor came with me, tossing a tennis ball back and forth, while Lucky padded silently beside us. We stopped for ice cream, and as we sat at the picnic table, an older man wearing a flannel jacket and a Vietnam veteran cap approached slowly. "That your dog?" he asked, pointing at Lucky. I nodded. "She found us, actually." He looked down at her with narrowed eyes. Then he said, "That dog's got Sergeant Boone's eyes." I stood up, my heart thumping. "You knew my dad?" He nodded slowly. "Henry Boone, served with him. Korea first, then trained with him stateside for a while in the 70s. That man could read a map better than any GPS. He used to say, 'If you ever get lost, don't panic. Just stop and remember who you are. The way will show itself.'" I swallowed hard. He used to say that to me too. The man gave me a long look. "He'd be proud. This dog, she ain't ordinary. You treat her right. She's carrying something bigger than just memories." I nodded. "I will. Thank you." He walked away without another word. Sam leaned in. "That was weird, right?" Trevor said, "Cool, but weird." Lucky just sat there, staring at the man as he walked off. That night, I dreamed of Dad. He was younger, standing in the woods near our house, wearing his uniform. Lucky stood beside him, and they were both looking at me. He didn't speak, but he held out something in his hand. It was a small silver whistle, the kind he used to carry on our hikes. When I took it, he smiled, nodded once, and turned away, disappearing into the trees. I woke up before dawn, heart racing. I got out of bed and opened the drawer of the old desk in the garage. There it was, the whistle, the same one from the dream. I didn't even remember putting it there. Lucky sat at the door, watching. I picked up the whistle and stepped outside. The morning was misty and cool. I walked into the yard, past the shed, into the woods. Lucky stayed close. After about 15 minutes, she stopped beside a rock outcropping and looked up at me. I waited. She barked once, sharp and clear. Then she walked around the rocks and sat. I followed and saw something half buried in the leaves. An old leather pouch. Inside was a map, hand-drawn, detailed, marked with notes in my dad's handwriting. It showed our land, but also places beyond. Old trails, markers, hidden spots he'd once shown me when I was a boy. But there were new markings, too, places I didn't recognize. I unfolded the rest of the map and saw something at the bottom. A message. Ben, if you're reading this, then you're where you're supposed to be. The rest is up to you. I sat down hard on the ground. Lucky nudged my knee, then lay beside me. I looked at the map again. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. Not even close. And I had the strangest feeling that the next step, whatever it was, would change everything. I didn't show Laura the map right away. Not because I didn't trust her. Far from it. She was my compass more than anything. But there was something sacred about what I'd found. Or maybe I wasn't ready to say the words out loud. The moment I shared it, it would become real. For now, I kept it tucked inside the old drawer in the desk, wrapped in the same leather pouch Lucky had unearthed. But she didn't forget. Every morning, as soon as I had my coffee, she'd be waiting by the door, her eyes alert and patient, her shaggy ears slightly tilted forward as if listening for the woods to whisper again. Wednesday morning came with a cold snap, and frost lined the fence posts as Lucky and I set out. I had traced the map the night before, studying the landmarks Dad had noted. There was a small X, a half-mile past where Lucky had found the photos, close to the old quarry line. I hadn't been that way since high school. We reached it before the sun fully crested the trees. The wind was quiet, the kind that made your breath sound louder than it should. Lucky led the way again, confident and quiet. She stopped near a gnarled tree whose base was surrounded by an uneven mound of leaves and twigs. I started clearing the area with my boot. There it was, an ammo box, military issue, just like the ones Dad kept his old gear in. The latch creaked open, and inside I found a small leather journal, wrapped with twine. I sat down right there on the cold dirt and opened it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Dad's. March 8th, 1997. If you're reading this, son, then maybe you've finally stopped long enough to look around. That'd be a first. I've left pieces of myself here, not because I'm hiding, but because someday I think you'll need to find them. You've always been stubborn, but there's more in you than you know. I turned the pages slowly. Each one was a mix of stories, reflections, and letters addressed to me. There were entries about the first time he saw me ride a bike without training wheels, the day I hit my first home run, and even the time we got lost in the woods and had to spend the night under a tarp. But it wasn't just nostalgia. He wrote about his fears, his regrets, and the things he never said out loud. Son, I know I didn't always say it right. I grew up in a world where men didn't talk much. We just did. But that doesn't mean I wasn't proud of you. I was, every day. By the time I closed the journal, my hands were shaking. Lucky sat beside me like a stone guardian, unmoving except for her breath, visible in the cold morning air. "Where'd he leave the rest of you, girl?" I asked. She wagged her tail once. We went back home in silence, and for the rest of the day, I kept the journal close. I thought about sharing it with Laura, but I still couldn't find the words. Instead, I read it in small pieces, always when I was alone, always when Lucky was nearby. That evening, after dinner, Sam came to me with a question. "Dad, did Grandpa ever write stories or something? Like, about you guys?" I looked up from the fireplace. "Why do you ask?" "I found this weird old shoebox in the attic. It's got letters. Some look like they're addressed to you." I stood quickly, my pulse skipping. We climbed up into the attic together. I hadn't been up there in years. The box was sitting near the old Christmas decorations. I opened it, and sure enough, more letters, all in Dad's handwriting, some in envelopes, some loose. "What made you come up here?" I asked. Sam shrugged. Lucky kept barking at the ceiling in the hallway. I thought maybe something was up here. Weird, right? I stared at the box. Yeah, real weird. Later that night, I spread the letters across the kitchen table. Laura stood beside me, reading over my shoulder. One of the letters read, "Ben, I left this one where I figured you'd never look. You always hated climbing ladders. But if you're reading this, maybe you're finally starting to see what matters. Don't stop now." She placed a hand on my arm. "He planned this, all of it." I nodded. "I think he did." "Then you need to finish it." I glanced at Lucky, who lay watching us from the hallway. "Yeah," I said softly. "I do." The next morning, Lucky took me farther than usual. We followed a dry creek bed that wound behind the neighbor's property, climbed a shallow ridge, and came to an old fence post with rusted barbed wire coiled around its base. On the map, there was a faint circle marked shed. We found the remnants of it just beyond the ridge. The walls had mostly collapsed, but the floorboards remained. Lucky pawed at one of the loose boards. I pried it up, careful not to break the rotting wood. There was a canvas bag tucked beneath. Inside was a folded U.S. flag, a few medals, and another letter. This one was shorter. "Ben, I wanted you to have this when you were ready. Not because I needed you to carry my legacy, but because I needed you to understand it. Honor isn't about wearing a uniform. It's about showing up for your family, for yourself, even when it's hard." I carried this flag through places I never want to describe, but the hardest battles were always at home. I held the letter to my chest and let the wind rush over us. Lucky stood beside me, her shaggy body pressed gently to my leg. We walked home slowly. Laura met us in the yard. "You okay?" I nodded. "He left a trail. One only I could follow." That night, I read the journal cover to cover. I laughed, I cried, and somewhere in between, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Forgiveness. For him. For myself. And all because of a dog that showed up out of nowhere, wearing a tag with his name on it. As I closed the journal, Lucky rested her head on my foot. "You're not done yet, are you?" I asked. She didn't move, just breathed deeply and stayed there, like a stone I could lean on. And I knew, whatever came next, she'd be there to show the way. I woke up just after 5. Not because of the alarm, but because I had a dream again. Dad was there, standing in the old smokehouse near the north fence line, the one we used to cure venison in when I was a boy. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me and pointed down at something in his hands. I couldn't see what it was. When I tried to ask, I woke up. I found Lucky already waiting by the back door, ears perked, tail still. She was ready, like she always was. The frost hadn't lifted yet. Our boots crunched across the yard as we made our way past the barn, toward the far end of the property. The old smokehouse was still there, barely standing. I hadn't stepped inside in probably 15 years. The hinges screeched as I pulled the door open. Lucky walked in first, nose low to the ground. Inside, it smelled like dust and rusted nails. The floor was half collapsed, the rafters bowed with age, but somehow it held. Lucky moved to the far wall and began pawing at the dirt. I grabbed a shovel from the outside shed and began to dig with her. After about 10 minutes, the metal edge of the shovel struck something solid. I cleared the soil and pulled it up. It was a wooden box, stained and sealed with a brass clasp on the front. Inside was a reel-to-reel audio tape, carefully labeled, for Ben. Along with a note written in that same blocky, slanted handwriting I'd come to know so well these past few weeks. Ben, there were things I never told you, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how. Maybe my voice will help where my words failed. Play this when you're ready, not a minute before. Dad. I sat there for a while, staring at the tape. Back at home, I had to dig through the garage to find the old tape recorder. It was dusty, covered with years of cobwebs, but I knew it would still work. Dad didn't believe in keeping junk. If it didn't work, he tossed it. It took a while to figure out which plugs still fit into the wall and which wires hadn't frayed with time. I finally got it working around noon. Laura came in as I was setting the tape into place. "What's that?" she asked. "Dad's voice," I said. Her eyebrows rose. "Seriously?" I nodded. Sam and Trevor were at school. It was just the two of us, and Lucky curled up beside the fireplace, her eyes half closed but still alert. I pressed play. The static was the first thing we heard. Then his voice, low and clear, filled the room. "Ben, if you're hearing this, it means you've found more than just memories. You've found the truth. I didn't leave you a treasure. I left you a trail." Laura sat beside me, silent. There were things I saw in my life, things I was a part of, that I never brought home. I tried to protect you from them. Maybe I went too far the other way. Maybe I shut you out when I should have let you in. But there's one story I need you to hear. It's the one that changed everything for me, and it started with a dog. My heart stopped for a second. Dad's voice continued. Her name was Ruby, German Shepherd. Found her in Korea during the coldest winter I've ever felt. She was guarding the body of a young private, barely 18, who didn't make it through the night. She didn't leave him, not until we got there. Then she walked up to me, looked me right in the eye, and sat at my feet. Just like Lucky. I named her Ruby because she reminded me of fire in the snow. She followed me the rest of the war. He paused. I brought her back stateside. Didn't ask permission. She was my shadow. She saved my life more times than I could count. But what she really did, what I didn't see until years later, was keep me human, keep me grounded. When she passed, I broke in ways I never admitted. Your mom knew. She saw it. That's when I started leaving things behind. pieces of myself, things for you. I didn't want you to become me. I wanted you to become better. Laura put a hand on my knee. Dad's voice grew softer. So if you're still following this path, it's because you're stronger than I ever was. And lucky, if she's still with you, then you've been given the same gift I had. Trust her. She knows where to take you. The tape clicked off. I didn't move, neither did Laura. The fire popped behind us. That explains everything, she whispered. The tag, the trail, the things she finds. I stood, heart pounding. Lucky had lifted her head, her gaze locked on me. I opened the front door. She trotted out ahead of me. We didn't go to the woods this time. She led me to the old mill road at the edge of our land, a place overgrown with weeds and rarely used since the county rerouted traffic 20 years ago. It twisted down through a patch of cedar and oak, eventually ending in a small clearing with a single stone in the center. I stopped when I saw it. The stone was carved. Not professionally. The letters were hand-etched. Uneven, but unmistakable. Ruby Faithful. Fierce. Free. I dropped to my knees. I never knew he'd buried her here. He never told me. Never once mentioned Ruby by name. Lucky walked to the stone, sniffed it gently, then lay down beside it. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind howled through the trees like an old voice trying to speak. I kept thinking about Dad's voice, about Ruby, about Lucky finding that grave like it had always been part of her route. I got up before dawn and wrote everything down. Every detail. Every trail we'd followed. Every object we'd found. And I started drawing my own map, one that would show Sam and Trevor where I'd been, what I'd seen, what their grandfather had tried to teach me. Not with lectures, but with breadcrumbs, real ones. Over the next few days, Lucky led me to 3 more hidden spots. One was a stone under the bridge near the edge of town, where Dad had carved the initials HB plus BB. It took me a second to remember. That was the spot where he first took me fishing. I was 7. He carved our initials into the rock and told me it was our secret marker. The second was an old metal lunchbox buried under the barn floor. Inside was a stack of index cards, each one with a quote. Some from books, some he wrote himself. One said, "Be the kind of man who doesn't need to speak to be heard." The third was a key. No label. Just a simple brass key tied to a red ribbon, hidden in the hollow of a fence post that marked the northernmost edge of our land. I brought it home and turned it over in my hands for an hour. I had no idea what it opened. But Lucky seemed content once I found it. She curled up in her usual spot by the fireplace and closed her eyes. And I sat there, staring at that key, wondering what door my father had left unopened just for me. The brass key sat on my nightstand for 2 days before I touched it again. I tried not to let it consume my thoughts, but it was always there, a quiet presence that tugged at the edges of my attention. Every time I looked at it, I thought about Dad's voice on that tape. "Trust her," he'd said. "She knows where to take you." And Lucky had never led me wrong. It was early Friday morning, just after Laura left for her shift at the clinic. The boys were still asleep, and the house was quiet except for the creaking of the old radiator in the hallway. Lucky sat by the door, head tilted, tail slowly tapping the floor. I slipped the key into my coat pocket and nodded. "All right, girl, show me." We walked out into a sky thick with gray clouds. A cold wind moved through the trees, rattling bare branches. I expected her to head for the woods again, but she surprised me. She turned and started down the long gravel drive that led to the county road. I followed her past the mailbox, past the miller's old fence, and across the field that hadn't been plowed in years. She didn't stop. Not until we reached the abandoned train depot at the edge of town. The building had been boarded up for as long as I could remember. As a kid, I'd dared my friends to sneak inside. The place had a reputation for being haunted, though in truth it was just forgotten, like so many things from my father's era. Lucky sniffed the base of the side door and sat down, tail brushing the dirt. I reached into my coat, pulled out the key, and stared at the rusted padlock. No way, I thought, but I tried it anyway. It clicked open. The door groaned on its hinges as I pushed it inward. Dust swirled in the air, lit by the slant of morning light through the broken slats of the roof. Lucky walked in first, her paws silent on the old wooden floor. Inside was nothing special at first, just crates, old signs, a rusted bench. Then I saw the metal cabinet tucked behind an overturned desk. Another lock. I tried the key again. It opened. Inside was a box. Not a military box this time, but a wooden chest, stained dark, about the size of a toolbox. I lifted it out carefully, heart pounding. Lucky sat quietly, watching. I opened the chest. Inside were layers of documents, photos, and envelopes. On top was a sealed letter addressed simply, Ben. I sat down on the bench and opened it. Ben, if you're here, then you've proven what I always knew. You were meant to carry more than I ever dared to say out loud. There's something I need to tell you about your grandfather. My hands trembled slightly. He wasn't the man I thought he was growing up. He served, just like I did. But there were secrets in his life. Things he buried deep. This box contains some of those truths. Things he never told anyone. I only found them after he passed, and I kept them hidden, not to protect him, but to give myself time to understand them. I never fully did. I believe you can. Your grandfather kept journals, maps, letters, some coded, some raw. You'll find them here. I don't know what it will mean to you, but I believe the past matters. Not because we have to live in it, but because we have to understand it before we can carry the future. Take your time. Let Lucky guide you. Love, Dad. I set the letter down and began pulling out the contents of the box. There were 3 small notebooks bound with string, a folded military discharge form with my grandfather's name, Harold Boone, and a stack of yellowed envelopes addressed to people I didn't recognize. One notebook had a leather cover, the initials HB carved into the corner. I flipped through the pages. They were filled with handwritten entries in a neat, looping script. Some were mundane, weather, daily tasks, but others hinted at something more. Mentions of a unit that didn't officially exist. Notes about locations overseas I'd never heard him speak of. And then a simple entry that stopped me cold. July 4th, 1951. They said we weren't there. But we were. We saw it. We buried it. No explanation. No context. Just that. I closed the notebook, heart racing. Girl, I said softly, what did you just walk me into? Lucky wagged her tail once. We stayed in the depot for over an hour. I took photos of everything with my phone, packed the items carefully back into the box, and locked the cabinet again. When we stepped outside, the clouds had broken slightly, casting pale light on the gravel lot. I looked back at the building. Somehow this forgotten structure had become a vault of truth, hidden in plain sight. At home, I cleared space in my office and began sorting through the documents. Laura peeked in once, but I waved her off gently. "Still piecing things together," I said. She smiled. "Take your time." The next few days were a blur. I read through every notebook, every letter. Slowly, a picture formed. My grandfather had been part of a covert unit operating during the Korean War. He'd witnessed things, operations that were never declassified, missions never acknowledged. One letter stood out, a confession to someone named Richard K. In it, my grandfather wrote about a village that had been evacuated under false pretenses, about something buried in the hills beyond the river. The tone was apologetic, weary, full of guilt. I didn't know what to do with it all. Lucky seemed to sense my hesitation. She stayed close, often curling up beneath my desk, occasionally nudging my hand when I'd been staring too long at one passage or another. On Sunday afternoon, Sam wandered into the office. "What's all this?" he asked. "Family history," I said. "The kind no one tells at Thanksgiving." He looked over the notebooks. "Grandpa did all this?" "Great-grandpa, actually." "Whoa," he paused. "That's kind of cool." "It's more than cool," I said. "It's complicated." He nodded and leaned down to pet Lucky. "She's still cooler?" I laughed. No argument there. That night, I stood in the yard staring up at the stars. The key was still in my coat pocket, though I had no more locks to open. It felt symbolic now, like a reminder. Dad had left a trail, but my grandfather? He'd left a legacy, one hidden beneath layers of silence and duty. And Lucky, she'd uncovered it all. Not with barks or digging alone, but by showing up, day after day, with quiet purpose. She padded over to me in the cold grass, sat down, and stared at the sky alongside me. We didn't need to say anything. We just needed to keep going. Wherever the trail led next, I was ready to follow. The map I'd drawn was no longer just about following Lucky. It had grown into something bigger, a sprawling web of trails, sites, journal entries, and names, all tied to a family history that none of us knew existed. Every night, I'd add more to it, lines connecting memories to locations, locations to stories, stories to questions I didn't yet have answers for. Lucky would lie nearby, watching me work, and I swear there were moments she seemed to nod off, only when I was finally starting to understand something new. Monday morning started colder than usual, a biting wind moving through the hills that carried with it the smell of snow. I sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee, watching the sky grow light behind the treetops. Lucky stretched out beside me, shaking out her shaggy coat and yawning wide. She looked up at me and gave one sharp bark. "All right," I said. "You've got something else to show me." She led me west this time, through the field that bordered the Meyer property, and then down into the gulch that used to be part of an old mining trail. I remembered playing down here with neighborhood kids in the summers, building forts out of stacked shale and hunting crawfish in the stream bed. It was overgrown now. Most of the paths were swallowed up by wild blackberry and brush, but Lucky moved through them like she'd walked that trail her whole life. We came to the remains of a hunting shack, not one I recognized. Its walls were nearly gone, but the floor was mostly intact. Lucky stopped near the back and pawed at a pile of leaves beside an exposed joist. I knelt and brushed the rest of the cover away with my gloves. There, half buried in the dirt, was a small oilskin pouch. Inside it, folded carefully, was a letter. Addressed to no one. The handwriting was unfamiliar. July 2nd, 1951. I warned Harold not to get involved, said it wasn't our mission, but he wouldn't let it go. He said he had a conscience, and that made him dangerous. We both knew we'd never make it out of that valley the same. I turned the paper over. No signature. Just another clue in a growing mystery. The pouch also held a faded black and white photograph. 2 men in uniform, one of whom I recognized as my grandfather. The other I didn't know. They stood shoulder to shoulder beside a jeep, mountains in the background. On the back of the photo was scribbled, "Before everything changed." Lucky sat quietly, tail brushing the ground. Her expression was calm, steady, patient. Back home, I added the photo to the growing collection in my office. I scanned it, pinned it to the map with a string that stretched across nearly 2 feet of wall now. I labeled it simply Unknown Soldier. That afternoon, I made some calls. I tracked down an old friend of Dad's, Richard Langston, a retired Army captain who now lived in Tennessee. I remembered him visiting when I was a kid, always with a thick beard and booming voice. "Ben Boone," he said when he answered, surprise in his voice. "Haven't heard that name in years." "I've got some questions," I said. "About my dad. About his dad." He went quiet for a second. "I was wondering when this would happen," he finally said. "What do you want to know?" So I told him. Not everything, but enough. The letters, the tape, the map, the photo I'd just found. There was another long pause. "I think it's time you come down here," he said. "There's a box I've kept for years. Belonged to your father. Said it wasn't time yet when he gave it to me. Maybe now it is." I looked down at Lucky, who was watching me from the hallway. "Can I bring a dog?" I asked. "You'd better." 2 days later, we loaded up the SUV. Laura helped me pack. The boys had school, and she had shifts she couldn't miss, but she didn't question any of it. "You're doing something important," she said, hugging me tight. "Just promise to come back with something worth passing down." "I will," I said. It was an 8-hour drive to the small town of Manchester, nestled in the rolling hills of southern Tennessee. We arrived just after dusk. Lucky had slept most of the way, her chin resting on the seat beside me, breathing slow and even. Langston's house sat on the edge of a pine grove, all stone and weathered wood. He met us at the door wearing flannel and jeans, his beard whiter than I remembered, but his handshake just as strong. "Inside," he said. "Got the box ready." The living room smelled like pipe smoke and leather. Books lined every wall. On the coffee table sat a metal chest with my dad's initials carved into the side. Langston handed me a folded sheet of paper. "He gave this to me 20 years ago, told me to keep it sealed until you came looking." I sat down and opened the box. Inside was a thick binder filled with copied documents. Maps, operation plans, debrief transcripts, notes in the margins that appeared to be my dad's handwriting. One in particular was circled in red ink. March 23rd, 1951, civilian shelter east of Hanyang burned. 2 unidentified survivors. Harold refused orders, discharged 3 days later. I blinked. "He walked away?" I asked. Langston nodded. "He refused a direct order, one that would have flattened that village. Claimed it wasn't necessary, said we were targeting ghosts. I didn't believe him until years later." I flipped the page. A black and white photo clipped to the top showed a hillside. Nothing unusual at first. But then I saw it. What looked like a structure half covered in brush. "What is this?" I asked. "That's what Harold believed was hidden in those hills," Langston said. He thought we stumbled onto something we weren't meant to see. Something old, not ours. He never explained it. Just said some things don't want to be found again. I sat back. Lucky lay quietly on the rug, watching us. He left me pieces, I said. Like a trail. Langston smiled faintly. Then you follow it. You don't stop until it stops. That night, I stayed in a spare room lined with framed maps and faded certificates. I laid out everything I'd brought: Dad's journal, Grandpa's letters, the notebook, the strange envelope from the hunting shack. I didn't sleep much. Neither did Lucky. The next morning, we said our goodbyes. Langston gave me a final envelope as we were loading the car. "This one's from me," he said. "To your dad. I never mailed it." I took it and nodded. The drive home was quiet. Lucky stared out the window for most of it, ears perked forward. When we arrived, Laura greeted us at the door. "Find what you needed?" she asked. "Not everything," I said, "but enough to keep going." That evening, I added new lines to the map. This wasn't just about my dad anymore, or my grandfather. It was about seeing the whole picture, even if some pieces didn't make sense yet. Lucky nudged the old compass on my desk with her nose, and I knew we weren't done, not even close. The next morning, the air felt heavy, not storm heavy, but thick with the kind of weight that tells you something's waiting to be uncovered. Lucky sensed it too. She hovered close, more alert than usual, her ears twitching even when the house was quiet. I'd barely poured my coffee before she was sitting by the door, staring back at me like, "Let's go." I grabbed my coat and the leather-bound notebook that had belonged to my grandfather, the one with the cryptic entries. On a hunch, I also slipped the old compass into my pocket, the one Lucky had found weeks ago under the deer stand. We stepped outside into a fog so dense I could barely see the end of the driveway. But Lucky walked forward like it was nothing new. She took me north, toward the ridge that marked the outer edge of our land. It was a steep incline, dotted with pine and brittle brush, and led up toward what locals called the Overlook, though no one really went up there anymore. I hadn't been up since high school. As we reached the crest, the fog thinned just enough to see the valley below. Lucky stopped and sat near a crumbling rock wall. I joined her and pulled out the notebook. There was a page I hadn't paid much attention to before. A short entry written in blocky, uneven letters. June 1952. The 3 stones mark the gate. Use the compass. Due south from the tallest tree. Hidden in shadow. I stood and scanned the ridge. There, about 20 yards away, was a lone pine, tall and still alive, while others around it had long since rotted or snapped. I walked to it, Lucky close at my side. I took out the compass. Due south. We moved slowly, the fog hugging the ground. After maybe 50 yards, Lucky stopped again. There, half covered in moss and soil, were 3 stones arranged in a triangle. Not naturally placed, deliberate. Set there by someone who knew what they were doing. I crouched and brushed the leaves away. Beneath them was wood. Old, worn, barely holding together. I pulled it up. A hatch. There was no handle, just a small iron ring embedded in the top. Lucky stepped back, watching. I pulled. It groaned open, revealing a short ladder leading down into darkness. I hesitated, then climbed in. It was a root cellar. Or at least it had been, but unlike any I'd ever seen. The air was dry, untouched. Wooden beams held the ceiling aloft, and shelves lined the walls, each one filled with boxes, tin canisters, jars. In the center sat a wooden table with a faded cloth draped over it. I stepped closer and pulled the cloth back. Beneath it were maps, letters, a set of field glasses, and a box marked, "Property of H. Boone." I opened it slowly. Inside was a journal. Not the same as the others. This one was leather, but newer, well kept. The pages were dense, every inch filled with handwriting. I flipped to the first page. "Ben, if this is where your trail has taken you, then you've earned the truth. Some of it you may never fully understand. Some of it may not sit right. But it's time you know what really happened." I sat on the edge of the table and read. The entries detailed missions that had never been part of official record. Not just combat, but recovery, retrieval, sites buried in remote locations, objects sealed in lead-lined crates. One mission described finding a stone marked with carvings no one could translate. Another referenced anomalous energy readings from a ridge in northern Korea. Exact coordinates matched the photo I'd seen in Langston's binder. And then there was a name. Dawson Ridge. I knew that name. It was a hill no more than 2 miles from where I now sat. A quiet rise that overlooked the north bend of the creek. I used to play there as a boy, never knowing it had any significance. But according to this journal, it did. Grandpa wrote about camping there alone after his discharge, about seeing lights in the woods, about strange sounds at night, mechanical and rhythmic. He claimed to have found buried metal, strange artifacts he never showed to anyone but my dad. There were drawings, diagrams, one that looked like a tunnel system. I felt dizzy. Lucky let out a soft whine. I looked up and realized I'd been sitting there for over an hour. Back at the house, I spread everything out on the table. Laura came in from work and just stared at it all. "Ben, what is all this?" "I don't know," I said. But my grandfather saw something, and Dad believed him. I showed her the journal. She read in silence, then finally said, "You think it's real?" "I don't know what I think, but I can't ignore it anymore." That night, I barely slept. My dreams were filled with shadowy forests and metal buried under moss, of Lucky barking into the wind, while I dug and dug and dug. The next day, I packed my tools, the journal, and a flashlight. Lucky jumped into the passenger seat without hesitation. We drove to the North Bend and parked just outside the old trailhead. We hiked for 20 minutes until we reached Dawson Ridge. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but Lucky moved with purpose, sniffing the ground near a cluster of fallen logs. She pawed once, then twice, then stopped. I knelt beside her. There it was. Metal. Not rusted scrap. Something smooth, angular, hidden beneath years of dirt and roots. I dug for over an hour. Carefully, slowly. What I uncovered looked like the corner of a hatch. No markings. Just a small indentation in the shape of a hexagon. I didn't have a key. But maybe I didn't need one. Lucky nudged something nearby with her nose. I turned to see a small box wrapped in wax cloth, wedged between 2 rocks. Inside was a metal tool. Hexagonal. My heart pounded. I fitted into the indentation and turned. The hatch clicked, then opened. Cold air rushed upward, and Lucky looked at me like she'd been waiting for this moment all along. The hatch groaned open just wide enough for me to slip through. The chill that rose from the darkness below wasn't just from the cold. It felt ancient, untouched for decades. I looked back at Lucky. She was standing completely still, staring into the opening with those unreadable brown eyes of hers. Her tail didn't wag, her ears didn't flick. She was waiting. I clicked on the flashlight and dropped down. The metal ladder creaked with each step, the kind of sound that echoes too much in small spaces. At the bottom was a narrow corridor made of concrete and lined with thick wiring. Pipes ran overhead, some still wrapped in insulation that was yellowed and flaking with age. The air smelled of iron, old dust, and something else. Something I couldn't place. Not mold or decay. Older than that. Lucky landed beside me with a soft thump, completely calm. We moved forward slowly, my flashlight beam sweeping the narrow space. After about 30 feet, we reached a door. Not wood, not the kind you'd find in a cellar. This was heavy steel, like something you'd see in a submarine. The wheel in the center was rusted, but it turned with enough effort. I braced myself and pushed. The door opened into a room. And for a long moment, I couldn't speak. It was a small chamber, maybe 20 feet wide, circular. The walls were lined with panels, switches, meters, dials, most of them dark or broken. In the center sat a table covered in dusty papers, a radio with its wires cut, and a single chair knocked to its side. On the far wall, a phrase had been painted in large black letters. "Do not open unless you believe." Lucky walked in and sat next to the chair. Her eyes followed me as I slowly approached the table. I picked up one of the papers. It was a handwritten report dated June 1952, signed with the initials HB, found third object. Located just outside sector boundary. Have not moved it. Appears dormant. Strange markings. No response to light or sound. A second note, on the back of the same page, read, "Langston disagrees. Wants to report. I say no. Not until we understand. This isn't enemy tech. It isn't ours either." I sat on the edge of the table and exhaled. This was what my grandfather found. This was what he tried to hide. Not just a structure. Not just guilt. But something else. Something he couldn't explain. There were more notes, drawings, diagrams of shapes that looked like artifacts. One resembled a sphere with notches along the sides. Another looked like a prism etched with symbols that didn't belong to any language I knew. One paper had only 3 words written over and over again. "It's still waiting." I heard a soft whimper. Lucky was standing now, nose pointed at a section of the wall near the floor. I walked over and knelt beside her. She looked up at me, then pawed once at the corner. I reached out, pressed my hand against the wall, and felt a loose panel. Behind it was a compartment. Inside, sealed in plastic, was a cassette tape. It had one word written in ink that had barely faded. Ben. I held it in my hand for a long time. Back at the house, I sat in the garage, the old tape player balanced on my knees. Laura came to the door but didn't come in. She just stood there, watching. "You found something else," she said. I nodded. "I think it's for me." I pressed play, static, then my father's voice. "If you're hearing this, it means you've found the outpost. And it means you've chosen to keep going. I never expected that. I hoped, but never expected." He sighed. "I know what you saw down there. The symbols, the reports. You're wondering the same thing I did. What does it mean? Why did he hide it? Why didn't anyone else say anything? The truth is, Ben, I don't think your grandfather was protecting us from what he found. I think he was protecting it from us. The tape clicked softly. You always asked me why he was so quiet. Why he sat out on the porch for hours without speaking. Why he never raised his voice, even when he was angry. He was listening. He was watching. Because once you see something like that, once you know it's real, you stop pretending you have the answers. He paused again. I think he wanted you to see it too. Not to scare you, but to remind you that we're not always the center of the story. Sometimes we're just the ones who carry the book a little further. So do that. Keep going. Don't look away. The tape clicked off. I sat in the silence of the garage, staring at the player. Lucky was curled beside me, her head resting on her paws, breathing steady. That night, I pulled out the map again. This time, I traced a new path. One that led beyond our property, beyond Dawson Ridge. The journal had one final reference, a location marked simply as Echo Station. No explanation, no coordinates, just that name. I spread out every note, every letter, every clue I had, cross-referenced with maps, grid lines, landmarks. By midnight, I'd narrowed it down to a section of forest land 2 counties west, technically public land, but barely maintained. The next morning, I packed the SUV again. Laura didn't ask questions. You'll come back? She asked. Always, I said. Sam gave Lucky a hug before we left. You take care of him, he whispered. Bring him back. We drove for 3 hours. The roads grew narrower, then turned to gravel. Eventually, I had to park at a ranger's gate and hike the rest of the way in. Lucky led again. Always ahead, always certain. We found it just past a bend in a dry creek bed, buried beneath moss and stone, half swallowed by the roots of an old tree. The structure wasn't large, just a dome of concrete barely visible above the ground. A steel hatch lay at the base, almost identical to the one at Dawson Ridge. Same hexagonal keyhole. I reached into my pack, same tool. The hatch opened. Lucky stepped back and sat. I climbed in. This time it wasn't just a room. It was a tunnel. Long, sloped, lined with the same concrete and pipework. At the end was another door. I braced myself, turned the wheel. Inside was a chamber filled with light. Not electric, not daylight. Something else. It pulsed. And Lucky, still above me, howled once, long and low, as if answering something I couldn't yet understand. The glow inside the chamber was soft and undulating, like light filtered through deep water. It wasn't coming from a single source, but seemed to radiate from the walls themselves. I stood just inside the threshold, unable to move at first, my breath shallow. The walls weren't solid concrete like in the tunnel. They were smoother, almost polished, embedded with veins of something metallic, something faintly luminescent. It reminded me of quartz, but moved like liquid under glass. Lucky didn't follow me down. Not yet. She stood at the hatch above, watching silently. Her head tilted slightly to one side, her eyes locked on me, unblinking. She wasn't afraid. But she wasn't casual either. She knew something was different here. I stepped farther into the room. The chamber was circular, with no visible seams or joins, no wires, no vents, no markings except for one thing, an object in the center. A pedestal no taller than my knees, and on top of it, a sphere. It was black, not like obsidian or onyx, but black like a void, as though it absorbed light instead of reflecting it. And it pulsed. Not with a sound, but a rhythm I felt deep in my chest, like a second heartbeat, like a thought forming, not mine but somehow meant for me. I didn't touch it. I walked slowly around it, studying every angle. There were no markings, no cracks, no sign of a mechanism or purpose, but the closer I got, the clearer it became that this wasn't just some artifact. It was intentional. Placed here. Waiting. I pulled out my grandfather's journal. The last page, the one that mentioned Echo Station, also had a crude sketch. A circle with lines radiating outward, and a single phrase scrawled beside it. "When it calls, don't run." I closed the journal. The sphere pulsed again. Stronger this time. Not louder, but more direct, like a thought that brushed against the edges of my mind. It wasn't a voice. Not really. More like a question. And it was asking me if I was ready. I crouched beside it and set down the compass. The old one Lucky had led me to weeks ago. As soon as it touched the floor beside the pedestal, the needle spun once and stopped, pointing directly at the sphere. The light in the walls grew brighter. Behind me, I heard the soft sound of pause. Lucky had entered the chamber. She moved to my side, then sat. Her eyes never left the sphere. For a moment, it felt like time folded in on itself. Like every path I'd walked, every buried memory, every letter, every hidden door had been leading to this moment. Not for discovery, not for fame, but for understanding. Because this wasn't about uncovering a family secret. It was about continuing a promise. I reached out. My hand hovered over the surface of the sphere. It was cold, then warm. Then neither. The pulse matched my heartbeat for a moment, then surpassed it. There was a sudden flash, not blinding, not loud, just complete. And I was somewhere else. I wasn't unconscious. I wasn't dreaming. I was aware, standing, but not in the chamber anymore. I was outside, in a forest, but not one I knew. The trees were taller, the sky a color I couldn't name. The air was dense with something that felt like memory. And then, in the distance, I saw him. My grandfather. He looked younger than in any photo I'd seen. Early 30s, maybe, standing near a stream, holding something in his hand. A notebook. He turned to look at me and smiled. But he didn't speak. Then my father appeared beside him. He looked the way I remembered from my childhood. Broad-shouldered, calm, always thinking. He placed a hand on Grandpa's shoulder. And then they both looked at me. Still silent. It wasn't a message. It wasn't an illusion. It was memory, a gift, maybe. And then, just as suddenly, I was back. In the chamber, kneeling beside the sphere, Lucky's head resting gently on my knee. The light had dimmed, the sphere was still. Whatever it had needed to show me, it was done. I stood slowly, legs shaking, picked up the compass. It spun again, then settled. I walked Lucky back through the tunnel, up the ladder, out into the clearing. The sky was still overcast, as if no time had passed at all. But everything inside me had shifted. We drove home in silence. Lucky curled in the passenger seat, dozing, tail twitching in her sleep. When we pulled into the driveway, Laura came outside. She didn't ask anything, just hugged me. Later that night, I opened a new notebook, began writing everything down. From the first moment I saw Lucky on the road, the tag, the photos, the letters, every sight, every clue, and the chamber. Not because I needed to prove it, but because someone else might need the trail someday, someone who doesn't even know they're looking yet. Lucky lay beside the desk, breathing slow and steady. As I wrote, she let out a soft woof in her sleep, then a quiet sigh. And I kept going. There was more to find, and she would show me the way. It started with a dog. That's what I kept thinking as I stood at the edge of the property line the next morning, Lucky sitting beside me like a shaggy sentinel. Just weeks ago, I'd been stumbling through a routine life: coffee at 6, truck troubles, quiet dinners, half-finished chores. And then she appeared, wearing my father's tag like she was carrying a message from another time. I looked down at her now, her ears twitching in the breeze, her eyes scanning the horizon like there was still something left to find. Maybe there was, but it didn't feel the same anymore. Something in the weight of the morning, in the stillness of the frost-covered ground, told me this path had come full circle. Back inside, I added the last pieces to the map. The hand-drawn sketches of Echo Station, the journal pages, the transcribed tape recordings. All of it spread across the office like a patchwork quilt of memory, mystery, and truth. Laura brought me a mug of coffee and sat beside me, resting her hand on mine. "Are you done?" she asked gently. I didn't answer right away. "I don't think it's about being done," I said. "It's about knowing when to stop walking and start telling the story." She nodded. The boys came in after school, their backpacks heavy with textbooks and snow clinging to their boots. Sam crouched down to scratch Lucky behind the ears. "She still hasn't barked at the mailman," he said. "She's polite," I replied. Trevor asked, "So what happens now? With the map? With all of it?" I looked at the wall, at the pinned notes, the black and white photos, the compass, the old letters, and I felt something shift, settle. "Now," I said. "I write it down, all of it. I tell it the way it happened, not polished, just true." I started that evening. The notebook filled quickly. My pen moved faster than I thought it could. The story flowed, not like something I invented, but something I had to get out before it slipped away. The next morning, Lucky was waiting by the door again. I opened it, expecting another journey, another trail. But instead, she walked slowly out into the yard, turned to face me, and sat. No bark, no whine, just a look that said, "This is yours now." We walked the perimeter of the land, one last time, from the creek that had always marked the back border to the rusted windmill by the old apple tree. I remembered every place she had taken me, every message hidden in the woods, every voice from the past that had come back to whisper something new. When we got to the ridge, the frost had started to melt. The hatch was still there, covered now with branches and leaves, but I didn't touch it. I knew what was inside. I knew who had built it, who had hidden it, and why. Some things didn't need to be opened twice. Lucky stood beside it, unmoving. I crouched beside her, scratched the thick fur behind her ear. "You did it," I whispered. "You brought it all home." She closed her eyes. That night, I sat with Laura in the living room. The fireplace cracked. The boys played a board game on the rug. Lucky lay near the hearth, her tail curled around her legs, snoring gently. "Did you ever think," Laura said, "that all this would start with her?" "No," I said. "But looking back, it had to. No one else could have led me. Not even Dad. It had to be her." I finished the final page of the notebook that night. I placed it beside the compass on the mantel. The following morning, Lucky was slower to rise. She ate her breakfast without a sound, then curled up in the sunlight near the window. She stayed there most of the day, rising only when the boys came home to greet them with a gentle tail thump. As the sun set, she walked over to me, nudged my hand, then walked to the door. I opened it. She stepped out, walked to the center of the yard, and sat down. I watched from the porch, heart heavy but calm. She looked back once, and then lay down, her head on her paws. Still. I ran to her, knelt beside her, whispered her name. She was warm, peaceful, but she was gone. I held her for a long time. When I finally stood, I carried her to the ridge. I buried her there, beside the hatch, beside the truth she had brought into my life. I marked the spot with a stone, just one word carved into it. Lucky. The wind rustled through the trees. Weeks passed, spring came. The boys asked about her often. I told them she was a gift, that she came to finish a job only she could understand. I shared the notebook with them when they were ready, and one day Trevor asked if he could draw the map on his bedroom wall. Of course, I said. That's what it's for. Sam helped him. They added paths we hadn't walked yet, places she hadn't shown me. But I knew that was right. That was what came next. New trails, new eyes. Laura painted over the old shed, turned it into a quiet reading room. I placed one item on the shelf inside, a green collar. Years later, I still walk the ridge sometimes. I sit beside the stone, hand on the grass, and talk. Not because I'm holding on, but because it reminds me what she did. She didn't just guide me through secrets or lead me to hidden doors. She brought my family back to life. She taught me how to listen, how to forgive, and how to carry forward what matters. One step, one path, one faithful heart. It started with a dog, and it ended with love.